What if the tiny country your empire once ruled grew up to make you look poor by comparison? That is exactly what happened. Singapore, a small island that Britain once controlled, dismissed, and nearly abandoned, is now one of the wealthiest places on the entire planet. We are talking about a nation with no rivers, no oil, no farmland, and no natural resources of any meaningful kind. A country so small you could drive from one end to the other in under an hour. And yet today, Singapore's income per person towers above that of the United Kingdom, the country that once flew its flag over Singapore's sky. How does something like that even happen? How does a place that started with nothing, a place that was once told it could not survive on its own, end up outperforming the empire that shaped it? The answer is not magic. It is not luck. It is one of the most deliberate, disciplined, and fascinating stories of national transformation the world has ever seen. In this video, we are going to walk through 10 powerful reasons why Singapore did not just survive. Point 1. The shock of rejection became the fuel for greatness. Let us start at the very beginning, because the origin of Singapore's success is actually rooted in one of the most painful moments in the country's history. In 1965, Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia. Yes, you heard that right. The young nation did not choose independence. Independence was forced upon it. When Kuan, Singapore's founding leader, stepped in front of cameras to announce the separation, he wept. He genuinely wept. Because in his mind, and in the minds of most people watching, this was not a celebration. This was a disaster. Singapore had no military, no currency, no water supply of its own, and almost no industry. It depended on Malaysia for its most basic needs. Being cut off felt like being pushed out of a lifeboat into open water. But here is what happened next. That pain, that fear, that burning sense of having no choice became rocket fuel. Singapore's leaders decided that if the world was not going to give them anything, they would build everything themselves. They would not waste a single day feeling sorry for themselves. They would work, plan, and outperform every expectation anyone had ever placed on them. Rejection became motivation. And motivation, when channeled into smart action, becomes transformation. Singapore's entire rise begins right here, in the sting of that rejection. Point 2. A leader who refused to play politics and chose results instead. Now, once you understand the fuel, you need to understand the engine. And the engine behind Singapore's early rise was Lee Kuan Yew himself. Lee Kuan Yew led Singapore from independence in 1965 until 1990, and his influence stretched long beyond that. What made him extraordinary was not that he was popular in the way most politicians want to be popular. He made deeply unpopular decisions all the time. He cracked down on corruption with a ferocity that made even his allies nervous. He told Singaporeans the truth about hard choices, rather than feeding them comfortable lies. Most politicians in the world say what people want to hear. Lee Kuan Yew said what Singapore needed to hear. He once famously said that he did not care whether a policy was right-wing or left-wing. If it worked, Singapore would use it. That kind of practical, results-driven thinking filtered down into every level of Singapore's government. Bureaucrats were paid competitive salaries so that talented people would choose public. Point 3. Turning geography from a curse into a crown. Here is something fascinating. The same location that once made Singapore a colonial prize made it an economic one too. Singapore sits right at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, right at the mouth of the Strait of Malacca. That strait is one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. Nearly 1/4 of all global trade passes through it every single year. Every ship moving goods between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe passes close to Singapore's shores. In the colonial era, Britain understood this. That is precisely why they wanted Singapore. Sir Stamford Raffles established a trading post there in 1819 because the location was simply too valuable to ignore. But after independence, Singapore did not just sit near the trade route and hope for the best. Singapore built one of the most efficient and capable ports in the entire world. They invested heavily in infrastructure, in technology, in training the people who ran the port. They made it so easy and so reliable to move goods through Singapore that shipping companies from every quarter of the world chose it over every alternative. Today, Singapore's port is consistently ranked among the top 2 or 3 busiest in the world. The containers that move through it carry goods worth trillions of dollars every year. Singapore did not create its geography, but it turned that geography into an engine of extraordinary wealth. That is the difference.
Point 4. Education became the national religion. So Singapore had motivation, leadership, and location, but none of that matters long-term without the people to execute the vision. And this is where Singapore made one of its smartest bets of all. From the very beginning, education was treated not as a nice-to-have, but as the single most important national investment. In a country with no oil to sell, no minerals to mine, no rivers to dam for power, the only resource Singapore truly had was its people. So Singapore decided to make its people as capable as humanly possible. Schools were built rapidly. Teachers were trained and paid well. The curriculum was rigorous, and standards were not lowered to make anyone feel comfortable. Students were pushed to think critically, to solve problems, and to be genuinely prepared for the demands of a modern economy. The results became visible within a generation. Singaporean students began appearing at the top of international rankings in mathematics, science, and
Point 5. Welcoming the world while others built walls. While many developing nations in the 1960s and 70s were turning inward, protecting local industries from foreign competition, and trying to build economies behind closed doors, Singapore did the exact opposite. Singapore opened its arms wide to the world. It said to multinational companies, "Come here. Bring your factories, your offices, your headquarters. We will give you a stable legal system, low taxes, efficient infrastructure, and a workforce that is ready to work. We will not make it complicated. We will make it easy." And the world came. American companies, European companies, Japanese companies, manufacturing firms, financial institutions, technology giants. They all set up operations in Singapore because Singapore made the case for itself brilliantly. This was not a naive strategy. Singapore made sure that when foreign companies came in, Singaporeans were learning skills, building expertise, and not just serving as cheap labor. The goal was always to move up the value chain, to go from assembling basic products to designing advanced ones. This openness to trade and foreign investment required a kind of confidence that most newly independent nations found very hard to muster. It meant trusting that your own people could compete. Singapore had that confidence, and it was justified. The economy grew at speeds that left economists genuinely amazed throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Point 6. Building a financial hub that the world trusted. Let us talk about money, because money is where things get really interesting. Singapore made a deliberate decision to become one of the great financial centers of the world. And to do that, it needed to do something that many countries struggle with enormously. It needed to be completely trustworthy. International money does not flow to places where the rules change overnight, where courts can be bought, or where contracts are not worth the paper they are written on. Money flows to stability, to predictability, to rule of law. Singapore built all three with almost obsessive attention to detail. The legal system was modeled on British common law, which international businesses already understood and trusted. Contract enforcement was fast and fair. Intellectual property was protected. Corruption in financial regulation was treated as a serious crime rather than an expected part of doing business. The result was extraordinary. Banks, asset management firms, insurance companies, and investment funds from all over the world chose Singapore as their Asian base of operations. The city became a place where the ultra-wealthy parked their money because they knew it was safe. Today, Singapore manages trillions of dollars in assets. Its own sovereign wealth.
Point 7. Clean streets, clean governance, and why that actually matters. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, this all sounds impressive, but surely no place is perfect. Surely there were shortcuts or dirty tricks along the way. And here is the honest answer. Singapore was not perfect, and some of its methods were controversial. Lee Kuan Yew governed with a firm hand. Press freedom was limited, political opposition faced real obstacles. Those things are true and worth acknowledging. But here is what is also true. Singapore built a level of clean, functional governance that is genuinely rare in the world. The streets are clean. The infrastructure works. Public housing, which houses the vast majority of Singaporeans, is well maintained and affordable. The trains run on time. The hospitals are excellent. The parks are beautiful. These things sound small, but they are not small at all. When your government delivers on basic promises, when the lights stay on and the water stays clean and the roads do not fall apart, people trust the system. And when people trust the system, businesses trust the system. And when businesses trust the system, investment flows in and the economy grows. Transparency International, the global organization that...
Point 8. The housing revolution that built a stable society. Here is something most people outside Singapore do not know. About 80% of Singaporeans live in government-built housing. And it is nothing like what you might imagine when you hear that phrase. When Singapore gained independence, housing was a genuine crisis. Slums were widespread, overcrowding was severe, sanitation was poor. Hundreds of thousands of people were living in conditions that no human being should have to accept. The Housing and Development Board was set up to fix this. And fix it they did, in a way that became a global model. Singapore built hundreds of thousands of apartments in planned towns across the island. These were not temporary fixes or bare concrete boxes. They were real homes, with real communities around them, with schools and shops and green spaces nearby. But here is the genius part. Singapore allowed people to buy these apartments at subsidized prices, using their savings from a mandatory national savings plan called the Central Provident Fund. This meant that ordinary working Singaporeans became homeowners. They had skin in the game. They had a stake in the country's stability and success. When people own something, they care about it differently. Singapore gave its citizens ownership of their homes, and in doing so, gave them a reason to believe in the future. A country of homeowners is a country with social stability, and social stability is one of the quiet foundations of economic prosperity.
Point 9. The courage to keep evolving when the world changed. One of the trickiest challenges for any successful country or company is this. Once you find a formula that works, staying hungry enough to change it before you have to. Singapore has done this repeatedly, and it deserves enormous credit for it. In the 1960s and 70s, Singapore focused on manufacturing. When wages rose and manufacturing became cheaper elsewhere, Singapore did not try to compete on low wages. It moved up the value chain into higher technology, into semiconductors, into precision engineering, into pharmaceuticals. When the knowledge economy exploded, Singapore invested in research and development, in universities, in attracting global talent to work on cutting-edge problems.
When the world began worrying about clean energy and sustainability, Singapore began building expertise in green technology and water management. The country has become one of the world leaders in water recycling technology, turning what was once a vulnerability into an exportable skill. When artificial intelligence and digital economies began reshaping the world, Singapore positioned itself as a hub for technology companies and digital finance. Each of these pivots required humility. It required leaders to say, the thing that made us successful yesterday might not be enough for tomorrow. That kind of self-awareness, combined with the willingness to act on it, is incredibly rare. Singapore has shown it again and again.
Point 10. The numbers that tell the full story. Let us bring this home with the numbers, because the numbers are genuinely jaw-dropping. When Singapore became independent in 1965, its income per person was roughly $500 per year. That placed it among some of the poorest countries in the world at the time. Britain, its former colonial master, was earning something in the region of $1,400 per person per year. Singapore was less than 1/3 of Britain's level. Fast forward to today. Singapore's income per person is now well above $80,000 per year when adjusted for purchasing power. The United Kingdom sits at roughly $45,000 to $50,000 per year in the same measure. Singapore has not just caught up, it has pulled nearly double. Think about what that means. In roughly 60 years, a nation that started poorer than its colonizer, a nation with no resources, no hinterland, and no guarantee of survival, transformed itself into one of the wealthiest countries per person on Earth. The United Kingdom, the empire that once held Singapore's fate in its hands, now ranks significantly below its former colony in nearly every measure of average prosperity. That is not an insult to Britain. Britain has achieved remarkable things and has its own proud story. But it is a lesson about what is possible when leadership, education, openness, discipline, and vision work together across.
And there it is, the story of how a small island, rejected by its neighbors and doubted by the world, climbed from the bottom to the very top. This was not just an economic miracle, it was a human one. It was built on the tears of a leader who wept on television because he feared his people might not survive. It was built on the hard work of ordinary families who believed that studying, saving, and contributing could actually lead somewhere. It was built on decisions that were brave enough to be unpopular and disciplined enough to be consistent across decades. What strikes me most about Singapore is that it never had the luxury of excuses. No oil, no size, no obvious advantages. Just people, vision, and relentless execution. And somehow, that turned out to be enough. More than enough. The lesson Singapore teaches the world is not about copying its exact policies or its particular style of government. The lesson is deeper than that. It is that a clear sense of purpose, honest leadership, investment in people, and the courage to keep adapting can take almost anything from nothing to extraordinary. If this story inspired you even a little, I would love to know in the comments.